So there are different types of muscle fibers or muscle cells. We have fast twitch and slow twitch. And the main thing to remember, I would say, is that fast twitch use mainly anaerobic respiration, and that slow twitch use mainly aerobic respiration. Because I think if you remember that, you can kind of work out what the other differences are going to be. So slow twitch contract slowly, fast twitch contract rapidly, which did come up on that previous question. Slow twitch are muscles that you use like every day, like just for standing up, just for balance, just for posture. Whereas fast twitch are muscles used for intense exercise or rapid or powerful contractions. I would write that down as well. Rapid contractions, which we saw in the last question, powerful contractions, intense exercise. So activities such as running, I don't know, cycling, swimming, things like that. Slow twitch can work out for a long time without getting fatigued, whereas fast twitch get fatigued quickly. And that makes sense because we said fast twitch use mainly anaerobic respiration. So they will get fatigued quickly because with anaerobic respiration, they're producing lactic acid, which leads to muscle fatigue or muscle cramp. Slow twitch use aerobic respiration, so release energy more slowly, whereas fast twitch use anaerobic, which releases energy or makes ATP quickly, but less. Less ATP, less energy, but quickly, which again makes sense because if they're being used for fast contractions and exercise, you need the ATP quickly, but it is anaerobic respiration, so it will lead to fatigue and less energy or ATP is produced overall. Slow twitch have lots of mitochondria, fast twitch have less mitochondria. Again, makes sense. Mitochondria are the site of aerobic respiration. So slow twitch using mainly aerobic are going to need more mitochondria, whereas fast twitch using mainly anaerobic are going to need less mitochondria. Slow twitch also have lots of blood vessels, whereas fast twitch have fewer blood vessels or not as much of a blood supply, not as dense a blood supply, not as dense a capillary network. Again, guys, makes sense, right? Fast twitch are using mainly anaerobic. They don't have as high a demand for oxygen because anaerobic does not need oxygen. Therefore, they don't need as much blood to be delivered because they don't need as much oxygen that is carried by the blood. So the blood supply is not as important. Don't get me wrong, they still have a blood supply, but they don't need to have a huge blood supply because their demand for oxygen is less than the slow twitch. Slow twitch have less glycogen stored. Makes sense. They don't need to store as much glycogen because they have a good blood supply. So they've got a really good blood supply. The blood is delivering oxygen and glucose, so they don't need to store as much glycogen. Whereas fast twitch need to store more glycogen, which makes sense because they have less of a blood supply. So they aren't getting as much blood. They don't need as much oxygen because they're doing anaerobic. They still need glucose, but without as much of a blood supply, how can they get as much glucose? Well, they can have stores of glycogen, which they hydrolyze into alpha glucose. Then they've always got glucose for anaerobic respiration, even though their blood supply is not as dense, okay? Hopefully that makes sense. Remember, anaerobic respiration doesn't need oxygen from the blood, but it does still need glucose. So if the blood supply is not as dense and they're not getting as much glucose via the bloodstream, it doesn't matter because they've got lots of stores of glycogen. Slow twitch, rich in myoglobin. Remember, this is a protein similar to hemoglobin that stores oxygen in muscle fibers. Slow twitch have lots of myoglobin. Again, it comes back to the fact that they do more aerobic respiration. They need more oxygen. And if the blood is not supplying enough oxygen, they've got stores of oxygen in their myoglobin. Fast twitch, less myoglobin. In fact, it's very little myoglobin, but that's fine because they don't need as much oxygen because they're doing mainly anaerobic respiration. So do you see what I mean? At the start, I said, if you just remember this, the rest of it should make sense. Like fast twitch use mainly anaerobic. Therefore, they have less myoglobin because they don't need a store of oxygen. They have fewer mitochondria because they're not doing as much aerobic respiration. They don't have as good a blood supply because they don't need as much oxygen, but they do have lots of glycogen because they still need glucose for anaerobic respiration. It should make sense if you remember which type of respiration each type of muscle fiber is mainly doing, okay? Let's do a little summary. So give 3 key differences between slow and fast. So I would always start off by saying slow twitch muscle fibers or just slow muscle fibers use mainly aerobic respiration. And then everything else follows on nicely. If they're doing mainly aerobic, you know they're going to have more mitochondria because that's the site of aerobic respiration. You know they're going to store more myoglobin. So they've got that protein that stores oxygen for aerobic respiration. You know they're going to have a dense blood supply or a dense capillary network, or maybe I shouldn't say dense blood supply. Let's just say good blood supply or a dense capillary network to supply that oxygen. Whereas fast use mainly anaerobic respiration. So because they're using anaerobic respiration, which occurs in the cytoplasm, they have fewer mitochondria. They have very little myoglobin or less myoglobin because they don't need that store of oxygen. They have fewer capillaries supplying blood. They still have a blood supply, don't get me wrong, but not as dense a blood supply because they don't need to have that guaranteed supply of oxygen. They do have more glycogen because they still need to make sure they've got glucose for anaerobic respiration. Slow have less glycogen stored. Okay, so remember, slow, they're less likely to get fatigued because they're using aerobic respiration. They're less likely to get fatigue. They're used for things like posture and balance, whereas fast are more likely to get fatigued because they're doing more anaerobic respiration, which produces lactic acid, and it also produces less ATP or releases less energy. But they're used for rapid muscle contraction, intense muscle contraction, and intense exercise or activities that require that intense or powerful muscle contraction. Okay, nice. I feel like that's quite straightforward, so I'm hoping you'll be okay understanding this without being in the live lesson. But let's have a look at some questions. This is where it goes wrong. So scientists investigated skeletal muscle fibers in mice. The scientists compared the muscle fibers of mice after 6 weeks of regular exercise. So these are trained mice. Imagine giving mice like a training program. I wonder what exercise they were making them do, like running on a wheel or something. But after 6 weeks of exercise, we're calling them trained mice. The control mice, just your normal mice that you're comparing them to, didn't do the exercise program. The scientists stained the muscle fibers from both sets of mice to show succinic acid dehydrogenase, it's obviously an enzyme, activity. The darker the stain, the greater the activity. Now I can see the trained mice, I've got more darker stain. This enzyme is used in the Krebs cycle. Okay, this makes sense. So we're staining the muscle fibers. The darker the stain, the more enzyme. And this enzyme is used in the Krebs cycle, which is part of aerobic respiration. So suggest reasons for the difference in the staining. So I'm thinking if the trained mice have darker stained muscle fibers, they have more of this enzyme. That tells you they're doing more Krebs cycle because the enzyme is used in the Krebs cycle. So the trained mice are obviously doing more aerobic respiration, which means they have more mitochondria. Let's have a look. I think I actually put the answer on before I tell you the wrong things. Yeah. So the trained mice are obviously doing more aerobic respiration. How did we know that? Well, they've got more enzyme activity of an enzyme used in the Krebs cycle. The Krebs cycle is a stage of aerobic respiration. So if the trained mice are having more Krebs cycle activity, the trained mice are seeing an increase in aerobic respiration, or they're doing more aerobic respiration. So you could then suggest, right, if they're doing more aerobic respiration, the trained mice must have more mitochondria, or they've seen an increase in mitochondria through their training. Or maybe through their training, they've seen an increase in the number of slow muscle fibers, because slow muscle fibers do more aerobic respiration and they have more mitochondria. So we're suggesting maybe this training led to an increase in the number of slow muscle fibers in the trained mice. More slow muscle fibers, more mitochondria, more aerobic respiration, hence why there's more enzyme activity in the Krebs cycle, which is only happening in aerobic respiration. Not too bad. Same information is given again, but let's have a look at question 2. The scientists then compared the length of time that the control mice that hadn't done any previous training and the trained mice that had been doing exercise for 6 weeks could carry out prolonged exercise. The trained mice were able to exercise for longer. This is an easy question, right, guys? We've just said the trained mice are obviously doing more aerobic respiration. So they have more slow twitch muscle fibers or more mitochondria. That explains why they are able to exercise for a longer period of time. If they've got more mitochondria and more slow twitch muscle fibers, they can do more aerobic respiration and produce more ATP for muscle contraction. It means they're going to delay the onset of anaerobic respiration, delay the onset of lactic acid production, delay the onset of muscle fatigue. Let's have a look and see if I've got those marks. Yes. Okay. We're not going to get marks for saying, well, the trained mice are doing more aerobic respiration or have more mitochondria, because we've put that in the previous question. But we should be able to continue it and say, because the trained mice are obviously doing more aerobic respiration, they can produce more ATP via aerobic respiration. That's going to help them exercise for longer. It also means aerobic respiration can continue for longer, or anaerobic respiration will be delayed, or they won't have to use anaerobic respiration as early or as much, which means less or no lactic acid or lactate will be produced, which again is going to help them to prolong their exercise. So this is obviously an advantage of continuous training. It's kind of suggesting to me that the more you exercise and the more you use your muscles, the more slow twitch muscle fibers develop, which is good because slow twitch muscle fibers are adapted to do aerobic respiration, which is good because it makes more ATP and it does not produce lactic acid. So yeah, this is obviously an advantage of using your muscles more, developing them through exercise to increase the number of slow twitch muscle fibers, and then you can delay the onset of anaerobic respiration. Nice, I like that question. I think that's a good question. Let's have a look at another exam style question. Now, imagine if you got this in the exam, you'd be thinking, nice. This is a table giving us properties of two different types of muscle fiber. Now, it doesn't say in the question, but we're assuming the two different types of muscle fiber are fast muscle fibers and slow muscle fibers, or we can call them fast twitch and slow twitch. Complete the table by writing the words high or low for the remaining three properties. Right. Well, we don't know which type is which yet, so let's see if we can figure it out. Type 1, high speed of contraction, high force generated. This is going to be fast twitch. Also, we've got high activity of the enzymes in glycolysis. Definitely fast twitch, because fast twitch use anaerobic respiration, which is just glycolysis repeated. Type 2, low speed of contraction, low force generated, lower activity of the enzymes in glycolysis. That's going to be slow twitch. They do glycolysis, but then they do link Krebs oxidative phosphorylation. It's not just glycolysis repeated immediately after each round of glycolysis. So you're going to see lower activity of the enzymes of glycolysis, and they contract less frequently with less force. So now we know which is which, we should be able to do the rest. Fast twitch would have a lower number of mitochondria because they use more anaerobic respiration, whereas slow twitch would have a higher number of mitochondria because they use more aerobic respiration. Activity of Krebs cycles enzymes. Well, Krebs cycle is a stage in aerobic respiration. So fast twitch, it would be low because they're doing more anaerobic, whereas slow twitch, it would be high because they're doing more aerobic, which includes the Krebs cycle and the enzymes involved. Rate of fatigue, high for fast twitch because it produces less ATP and it does produce lactic acid, which causes muscle fatigue. Slow twitch, low. Muscles can continue contracting for much longer because aerobic produces much more ATP and it does not produce lactic acid. So we're not going to experience muscle fatigue if we have more slow twitch muscle fibers. Nice and easy.